Before we begin, I ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you these untold stories of the famous. The morning mist hung over Prague's cobblestone streets like a shroud, and I remember thinking it looked exactly like the kind of place where someone's life could change forever. It was March 2001, and we were deep into filming the Bourne Identity. I stood at the window of my hotel room, watching the city wake up below, completely unaware that in a few hours, I'd learned just how thin the line was between method, acting, and madness. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. 30 years old, supposedly at the peak of my career, but carrying a weight that felt like it might crush me. The success of Good Will Hunting had opened doors I'd only dreamed of, but it had also created a prison of expectations. Every role now came with the unspoken question: can Matt Damon actually be an action star? Or is he just a kid who got lucky with a script? The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. Frank Marshall's voice carried that particular strain of a producer managing chaos across 3 time zones. Matt, we need to talk about today's sequence. The car chase through Wenceslas Square. Doug's got ideas. My stomach dropped. Doug Liman's ideas usually meant someone was about to have their insurance voided. 20 minutes later, I stood in the controlled chaos of our production base, watching Czech crew members position cameras along a route that suddenly looked less like a movie set and more like a death trap. The narrow streets, the stone buildings, the morning traffic that no amount of production assistance could completely control. It all felt different now that I knew what Doug had in mind. The stunt drivers are incredible, Doug was saying, his hands sketching invisible trajectories in the air. But there's something missing. The audience needs to feel like they're in that car with Bourne, experiencing his desperation. You want me driving? I said. His eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. Just the wide shots. Gary's worked out a completely safe route. Gary Powell approached us, and I found myself studying his weathered face for any hint of concern. 30 years of making impossible things look easy, and he still had all his limbs. That had to count for something, right? If we're doing this, Gary said, you need to understand something crucial. The moment anything feels wrong, a pedestrian, unexpected traffic, even a pigeon, you radio us and we aboard. This ISN tab out, proving you're tough, Matt. It's about staying alive long enough to cash your paycheck. But he was wrong. This was absolutely about proving something. To studio executives who still saw him as the Good Will Hunting kid, to action stars who dominated the genre for decades, and most importantly, to the voice in my head that whispered I was a fraud every time someone called me Amo Vistar. We walked the route together, Gary pointing out every turn, every potential hazard. The plan seemed elegant. I'd drive a modified BMW through a predetermined course while cameras captured the sequence from multiple angles. Professional drivers in pursuit vehicles would follow at choreographed distances. Remember, Gary said as we stood at the starting position, Bourne might be desperate, but Matt Damon is in complete control. The second you start believing you're actually being chased, that's when people get hurt. I nodded, but something was already shifting inside me. For months, I'd been studying Bourne's psychology, living in his world of paranoia and split-second decisions. Now I was about to literally become him. That's when I noticed the first sign that this day wouldn't go according to plan. A Czech traffic coordinator was arguing with our assistant director in rapid-fire Czech, gesturing frantically toward the main square. From what I could gather through the language barrier and increasingly animated hand gestures, morning construction work had closed one of our planned routes. They'd have to adjust on the fly. No problem, Doug said when informed. We'll improvise. That's what makes it feel real. Gary's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. In the stunt world, improvise was a 4-letter word. But Doug was the director, the studio was breathing down our necks about budget, and we'd already shut down half of Prague for this sequence. As the morning progressed, small complications multiplied. The radio frequencies kept picking up interference from Prague's emergency services. One of the pursuit cars developed brake trouble during final checks. The weather was changing, bringing the possibility of rain that would make the ancient cobblestones slick as ice. Maybe we should postpone, I suggested, watching clouds gather overhead. We can't, Frank said, appearing at my elbow with that particular look producers get when they're recalculating how much each day of delay costs. We lose Prague in 3 days. If we don't get the sequence, we don't get the movie. The movie. Everything came down to that. Not my safety, not the crew's concerns, but whether Universal Pictures would have a marketable action film to release in theaters. I understood the math, even if I didn't like it. Franca Patini found me, during one of the delays, studying my face with the kind of intensity that had made her perfect for Marie. "You look like a man preparing for his execution," she said. "Just getting into character. Or maybe getting the character into you." Before I could answer, Doug's voice crackled over the radio. "All right, people, let's make some movie magic. Weather windows closing. We go now, or we don't go at all." I walked to the BMW, its engine already running, exhaust visible in the cold Prague air. The car had been modified for filming. Cameras mounted in the interior, safety equipment that looked impressive but felt suddenly inadequate. As I approached, one of the Czech crew members crossed himself. It was probably superstition, but my hands started sweating anyway. Gary appeared beside me one final time. "Matt, listen to me. You're about to drive fast through a foreign city in a car you've never operated under pressure. Every instinct you have is going to tell you to push harder, go faster, make it look more dramatic. Ignore every single one of those instincts. Drive like your mother is watching." I slid behind the wheel, and immediately everything felt wrong. The steering wheel was positioned differently than I'd expected. The pedals were more sensitive. Through the windshield, Prague's narrow streets looked like a maze designed by someone who hated cars. "Radio check," came Gary's voice through my earpiece. Loud and clear. "Pursuit vehicles in position?" "Affirmative." "Camera crews ready?" "Rolling on all units." Doug's voice cut through the chatter. "Remember, Matt, you're not just driving a car. You're a man who's just discovered his entire life is a lie, and the only way to survive is to trust instincts he didn't know he had. Make us believe it." I took a deep breath, tasting exhaust and my own fear. My hand found a gear shift solid and cold against my palm. In 30 seconds, I'd be racing through Prague at speeds that would make rational people run for cover, trusting my life to reflexes I'd never tested in a plan that was already falling apart. The rational voice in my head made one final, desperate plea. "Walk away. You're an actor, not a stunt driver. Nobody will think less of you for being smart." But as I revved the engine and felt its power vibrating through my chest, I realized that wasn't true. It'd think less of me. For the rest of my career, every action sequence would carry the weight of this moment. The day I chose safety over authenticity, comfort over truth. "Action." Doug's voice exploded through my earpiece. I dropped the car into gear and pressed the accelerator. The BMW leaped forward like a caged animal suddenly freed, and in that instant, Matt Damon ceased to exist. There was only Jason Bourne, running for his life through the streets of a city that wanted him dead. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that in approximately 7 minutes, the line between character and actor would disappear entirely, and I'd discover exactly how far I was willing to go in the name of making people believe. The cobblestones beneath the BMW's tires felt like driving over a washboard made of granite. Every bump sent vibrations through the steering wheel and into my bones, making precise control nearly impossible. The speedometer climbed past 40 kilometers per hour, not fast by highway standards, but terrifying when you're threading between medieval buildings that were old when Shakespeare was young. "First mark approaching." Gary's voice crackled in my earpiece. "Remember, smooth acceleration out of the turn. Keep it tight to the left barrier." I could see the barrier he meant, orange plastic pylons that looked about as substantial as coffee cups. Beyond them, Prague citizens were going about their morning routines, completely unaware that a Hollywood production was about to turn their peaceful square into a demolition derby. The first turn came faster than expected. The BMW's modified suspension was stiffer than any car I'd ever driven, and what should have been a gentle curve became a wrestling match between physics and willpower. The rear wheels slipped slightly on a patch of morning moisture, and for a heart-stopping moment, I felt the car want to continue straight into the outdoor cafe where an elderly woman was reading her newspaper over coffee. I corrected hard to the left, maybe too hard, and the BMW's nose swung toward the opposite barrier. The orange pylons scattered like bowling pins as I clipped the line, plastic fragments bouncing off the windshield with sounds like gunshots. "Matt, you're running wide." Gary's voice was tight, with controlled panic. "Bring it back to center." But center was a relative concept when you're doing 50 through streets designed for horse-drawn carriages. The pursuit car behind me, a black Mercedes driven by one of Gary's best drivers, was supposed to be following at a safe distance. Instead, it was gaining fast, its driver apparently unaware that I was no longer following the predetermined route. "Pursuit 1, back off." I heard Gary shout over the radio. "Target is off course." Target. That's what I'd become. Not Matt Damon, not even Jason Bourne, but a moving target in someone else's choreography that was rapidly falling apart. The second mark was supposed to be a gentle S-curve through what our location scouts had described as a charming pedestrian area. What they hadn't mentioned was that Prague's morning construction crews didn't follow Hollywood scheduling. A massive street cleaning truck had appeared overnight, its rotating brushes spinning as it worked its way through the square, completely blocking the planned route. "Construction vehicle in the route." I shouted into my radio. "I can't make the turn." Static answered me. The radio interference that had been a minor annoyance during setup was now a potentially fatal communication breakdown. I could see Gary frantically gesturing from his position near camera 3, but his instructions were lost in electronic noise. The street cleaning truck loomed larger in my windshield, its operator oblivious to the BMW bearing down on him at increasing speed. I had maybe 3 seconds to choose: brake hard and risk being rear-ended by the pursuit car that was still gaining behind me, or swerve into the unplanned territory off Prague's morning traffic. I chose to swerve. The BMW lurched to the right, into a narrow side street that our scouts had marked pedestrian only on the production maps. The space between the buildings couldn't have been more than 3 meters wide, and suddenly I understood why European cars were smaller than American ones. Stone walls flashed past on both sides, close enough to touch if I'd been stupid enough to roll down the windows. "Where the hell is he going?" I heard someone shout through the radio static. It might have been Doug or Gary or one of the camera operators trying to track a shot that had gone completely off script. The side street curved sharply to the left, and I realized with growing horror that I was driving blind. Our careful reconnaissance had covered every inch of the planned route, but this narrow alley was terra incognita. For all I knew, it deadened into someone's living room. That's when I saw the delivery truck. It was backing out of what must have been a service entrance, moving slowly but steadily into my path. The driver was looking over his shoulder, focused on not hitting whatever was behind him, completely unaware that a runaway movie production was about to solve his parking problems permanently. Time dilated the way it does in dreams or disasters. I could see every detail with crystalline clarity. The truck's mud flaps swaying as it reversed, the driver's concentration visible through his rear window, the narrow gap between the truck's bumper and the stone wall that was either just wide enough for a BMW or exactly the right size to turn me into automotive origami. My foot found the brake pedal, but the ancient cobblestones offered about as much traction as wet ice. The BMW's wheels locked up, and instead of slowing down, I started sliding sideways, the car rotating like a drunk figure skater. Matt, do you copy?" Gary's voice finally broke through the static, but I was too busy trying not to die to respond. The gap was coming up fast, maybe 6 feet of space between crushing stone and crushing truck. In the movies, this was where the hero would thread the needle with supernatural precision, emerging unscratched on the other side to the cheers of impressed onlookers. But this wasn't a movie anymore. This was physics, and physics didn't care about box office receipts. I straightened the wheel and aimed for the gap, knowing that if I was wrong about the distance, if truck was moving faster than I calculated, if the BMW was wider than I hoped, if Prague's medieval builders had been less precise than modern engineering, the next few seconds would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. The world contracted to that narrow slice of space between destruction and salvation. I could hear Meown breathing, harsh and rapid in the enclosed cockpit. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, Every muscle in my body tensed for impact. The BMW shot through the gap with inches to spare, close enough that I could see the surprise on the delivery driver's face as a Hollywood production thundered past his window. But relief was premature. The alley was curving again, and ahead I could see something that made my blood turn to ice water. A group of schoolchildren was crossing the narrow street, maybe 20 kids in bright jackets, led by a teacher who was checking her watch and hurrying them along. They were exactly where any reasonable person would expect schoolchildren to be at 9 in the morning, walking to school through their neighborhood, completely unaware that their quiet street had become the set of an action movie. Time seemed to stop entirely. I could see individual faces, bright with the innocence of kids who still believed the world was a safe place. The teacher looked up at the sound of my engine, her expression shifting from mild annoyance to absolute terror as she realized what was bearing down on her students. My foot slammed the brake pedal to the floor, but momentum doesn't negotiate. The BM continued sliding forward on the treacherous cobblestones, and I found myself calculating distances with the cold precision of someone whose life depended on getting the math exactly right. Stopping distance on wet stone at current speed, approximately 30 meters. Distance to the children, approximately 25 meters. Margin for error, 0. Move! I screamed, though I knew they couldn't hear me through the BMW's windows. The teacher was already shouting at her students, pushing them toward the narrow sidewalks. But 20 children didn't change direction instantly, no matter how urgent the situation. This was the moment when method acting became attempted manslaughter, when Jason Bourne's fictional desperation became Matt Damon's very real nightmare. I was no longer performing for cameras. I was trying to avoid spending the rest of my life knowing I'd killed children for the sake of entertainment. The BMW's anti-lock brakes chattering against the cobblestones sounded like machine gun fire. Through the windshield, I watched the teacher grab 2 of the slower children, literally lifting them out of my path. The other kids scattered like startled birds, their bright jackets flashing against the gray stone buildings. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, aiming for what looked like a slightly wider section near the sidewalk. The BMW responded sluggishly, its tires fighting for purchase on stones worn smooth by centuries of traffic. The rear end swung wide, and suddenly I was sliding sideways again, no longer sure which direction was forward and which was certain disaster. The radio erupted with panicked voices, Gary shouting coordinates, Doug demanding to know what was happening, someone screaming for medics. But all of it faded into background noise as I focused it in the only thing that mattered, stopping this 3,000-pound missile before it destroyed everything I'd worked for and lies I could never replace. The children's faces flashed past my side window as the BMW completed its spin, and I caught a glimpse of wide eyes and open mouths, expressions of shock that would haunt my dreams for years to come. But they were moving, scrambling towards safety, and for one blessed moment, it looked like we might all survive this insanity. That's when I heard the sound that turned blood to ice, the screech of metal on stone, coming from somewhere behind me. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of the black Mercedes pursuit car, its driver fighting his own battle with Prague's unforgiving streets. He'd followed me into the narrow alley, but unlike me, he wasn't slowing down. The Mercedes was sliding sideways, completely out of control, its driver's face visible through the windshield. Professional calm replaced by the wide-eyed terror of someone who'd just realized he was about to become part of the accident instead of just filming it. I was still sliding backward, my BMW now rotating slowly like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. The Mercedes was sliding forward. Basic physics said we were going to meet somewhere in the middle, with approximately 6 tons of German engineering and 2 very mortal human beings caught in the collision. Gary, I screamed into the radio, not caring if anyone could hear me through the static. The pursuit car. He can't stop. Time stretched like taffy as I watched 2 unstoppable forces approach their inevitable meeting. The schoolchildren were safely pressed against the buildings now, their teacher herding them like a sheepdog protecting her flock. But their safety had come at a cost. The narrow street that had saved their lives was about to become a kill box for the two drivers stupid enough to think they could control cars on medieval cobblestones. The Mercedes loomed larger in my mirror, its driver frantically working the steering wheel in a desperate attempt to avoid the collision that physics had already decreed. I could see his mouth moving, probably praying in whatever language stunt drivers used when their luck ran out. This was it. This was the moment when a carefully planned movie stunt became an uncontrolled disaster. When two professional drivers discovered that Prague streets didn't care about their experience or their safety equipment or their insurance policies. In about 2 seconds, I was going to learn whether BMW's reputation for engineering excellence extended to keeping their passengers alive during head-on collisions with other BMW's corporate siblings. I closed my eyes and waited for impact, wondering if this was how Jason Bourne would have died, not in a blaze of heroic glory, but in a stupid accident caused by overconfidence and underestimating the dangers of taking fiction too seriously. The last thing I heard before the world exploded was the sound of my own voice, screaming a word that encompassed everything I was about to lose. Silence. The kind of absolute, tomb-like silence that only exists in the microseconds after disaster strikes and before human consciousness fully processes what just happened. My BMW sat motionless against the stone wall of a Prague bakery, steam rising from the crumpled hood like incense at a funeral it somehow avoided attending. The Mercedes had missed me by perhaps 18 inches, close enough that I could see the spiderweb cracks in its windshield where the driver's head had snapped forward, close enough that paint from both vehicles now decorated the medieval stonework like some twisted art installation. We'd created a sculpture of near death, a monument to the moment when Hollywood arrogance collided with European reality. I sat behind the wheel, hands still gripping the leather so tightly that my knuckles had gone past white into a sickly blue. My body hadn't yet realized it was still alive. Every nerve ending was screaming contradictory messages, adrenaline insisting I was still in mortal danger, while my eyes tried to process the impossible fact that the Mercedes was sitting motionless 15 feet away, its driver slumped over his steering wheel, but moving, breathing, alive. The first sound to penetrate the silence was a child crying. One of the school children who'd scattered like startled sparrows was now sobbing against her teacher's skirt, the reality of what she'd just witnessed finally sinking in. The sound cut through my shock like a blade, bringing the world rushing back with devastating clarity. Jesus Christ. The words came out as a whisper, more prayer than profanity. Then the radios exploded. Unit 3 to base. We have multiple vehicle contact in Sector 7. Medics to the alley now. Where the fuck is our star? Someone tell me Matt Damon is breathing. Get the insurance people on the phone. Kill the cameras. Kill them all. That last voice was Doug's, high and tight with panic that wasn't entirely professional. A director could survive actors getting injured. It happened all the time. But a director could not survive actors getting killed, especially not actors worth 8 figures who'd just convinced half of Hollywood that they could handle their own stunts. My door wouldn't open. The impact with the stone wall had bent the frame just enough to jam the mechanism, trapping me inside what now felt less like a luxury car and more like an expensive coffin. Through the starred windshield, I could see people running toward us from all directions. Crew members, Czech police, what looked like half the population of Prague converging on our impromptu disaster scene. Gary Powell appeared at my window, his weathered face pale beneath his usual tan. He was saying something, his mouth moving urgently, but I couldn't hear him through the glass and the ringing in me ears that I was just beginning to notice. When had that started? During the spin? The near collision? Or just now, as my nervous system finally caught up with what my body had endured? Gary was pulling on the door handle now, his expression shifting from concern to something approaching panic when it wouldn't budge. Behind him, I could see Doug gesticulating wildly at someone off camera, probably Frank Marshall, who would already be calculating the cost of this disaster in dollars, schedule delays, and potential lawsuits. A Czech firefighter appeared with a crowbar, and the sound of metal being pried apart finally penetrated my cocoon of shock. Fresh air rushed in, carrying the scent of Prague morning, coffee from a bakery, exhaust from idling cars, and underneath it all, the metallic smell of adrenaline and fear. Matt. Gary's voice was professionally calm, but I could hear the tremor underneath. Can you harm? Are you hurt? I tried to answer and discovered that my voice had disappeared entirely. My throat felt raw, as if it'd been screaming, though I couldn't remember making a sound after that final "no" before the world went sideways. He's in shock, someone said. A medic, probably, though everyone looked the same through my tunnel vision. We need to get him out of there, check for injuries. Hands reached in to help me, and I realized that my legs weren't working properly. Not injured, at least I didn't think so, but disconnected from my brain's commands, as if the wiring between intention and action had been severed by trauma. They pulled me from the BMW like extracting a body from a crime scene, and I found myself sitting in Prague cobblestones that felt solid and real in a way the car no longer did. The stones were cold against my palms, worn smooth by centuries of use, and I pressed my hands against them to convince myself that I was actually here, actually alive, actually still Matt Damon, and not just scattered atoms and regret. The other driver, I managed to croak. Is he conscious? Gary replied, his relief evident. Banged up, possible concussion, but conscious. Paramedics are with him now. Through the crowd, I caught sight of the Mercedes driver being helped onto a stretcher, his movements slow but deliberate. Alive. We were both alive, despite physics and stupidity and the basic mathematical impossibility of two cars occupying the same space at the same time. The school children were being led away by their teacher, who kept looking back over her shoulder with an expression I'd never seen before. The look of someone who just watched entertainment almost become tragedy. The bright jackets that had seemed so cheerful minutes ago now looked like warning flags, reminders of how close we'd come to destroying innocence along with ourselves. Matt. Doug's voice cut through the chaos, and I looked up to see him crouching beside me, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Director, friend, business partner, conspirator, all warring for dominance in his expression. How do you feel? Can you stand? I tried to answer honestly, to tell him that I felt like I just stared into the abyss and found it staring back, that every cell in my body was vibrating with the knowledge of how thin the margin was between life and death, between career-making authenticity and career-ending catastrophe. Instead, what came out was, did we get the shot? Doug's expression flickered, surprise, then something that might have been admiration, then concern again. The cameras were rolling, yes. But Matt, that's not important right now. What was important, wasn't it? This whole nightmare had started because we needed the shot, needed the authenticity that only real danger could provide. Now we had it, along with 2 damaged cars, a traumatized crew, and the kind of near miss that insurance companies have nightmares about. Frank Marshall materialized beside Doug, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the rapid-fire code that producers use when disasters threaten to become headlines. No injuries requiring hospitalization. Mechanical failure. Completely under control. Completely under control. I almost laughed, but stopped when I realized it might come out ashysteria instead. Nothing about this situation was under control. We'd just proven that Hollywood's careful choreography was no match for Prague's medieval streets and basic physics. The studio's going to want a full report, Frank continued, now addressing Doug directly. Insurance investigators are en route. We need to get our story straight. Our story. As if what had just happened was subject to editing, like a rough cut that could be improved with better angles and tighter pacing. But I could feel the truth of it settling into my bones. This wasn't a story. This was reality, messy and dangerous, and completely indifferent to our narrative needs. The Czech police arrived with official efficiency, taking photographs and measurements, treating our movie set like an actual crime scene, which I suppose it was. We'd endangered civilians, damaged public property, and come within inches of turning Prague's morning commute into an international incident. Mr. Damon, one of the officers said in careful English, we need to ask you some questions about what happened. What happened? How do you explain that you decided to become someone else, so completely that you'd forgotten the difference between fiction and reality? How do you tell a police officer that you nearly killed children because you wanted to convince strangers that you were tough enough to be Amovistar? I lost control of the vehicle, I said, the words feeling inadequate and simultaneously too revealing. The streets were slippery. Construction blocked our planned route. All true, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I'd lost control of more than just a car. I'd lost control of my judgment, my priorities, and my sense of proportion. I'd confused authenticity with recklessness, and nearly paid a price that no amount of box office success could have justified. The medics insisted on checking me thoroughly. Blood pressure, pupil response, coordination tests that revealed the extent of my shock even as my mind insisted I was fine. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold a water bottle steady, and my heart rate was running at nearly twice normal, as if my body was still trying to outrun danger that no longer existed. "You should go to the hospital," the lead medic said, "for observation. Shock can mask serious injuries." "I'm fine," I said automatically, then realized how hollow the words sounded. I wasn't fine. I might not be fine for a very long time. Doug was pacing now, his creative energy having nowhere productive to go. "We can't lose the day," he said to Frank. "We're already behind schedule. Maybe we can salvage some of the footage, use it differently." "Doug," Gary's voice carried a warning. "We just avoided killing our lead actor. Maybe we should focus on that." "I'm focused on that," Doug snapped, then immediately looked apologetic. "I mean, of course Matt's safety is the priority, but we still have a movie to make. A movie to make." The words hung in the Prague air like exhaust fumes, a reminder that this disaster was just another obstacle in Hollywood's relentless machinery of entertainment production. We nearly died, but the schedule remained unchanged. The budget still demanded efficiency. And somewhere in Los Angeles, executives were already calculating how this incident would affect the film's marketing campaign. I stood up slowly, testing my balance, and found that the cobblestones felt less solid than they had a few minutes ago. Everything seemed unstable now, not just my legs, but my entire understanding of what I was doing and why it mattered. The BMW sat against the bakery wall like a monument to hubris, its crushed hood and starred windshield telling the story of what happened when Hollywood physics met European reality. Looking at it, I realized that something fundamental had changed in the space between impact and aftermath. I was still Matt Damon. I was still the lead actor in the Bourne Identity. But I was no longer the person who'd climbed into that car 20 minutes ago, confident that professional drivers and careful planning could eliminate real danger from simulated peril. That person had died in the collision, replaced by someone who understood viscerally that the line between performance and reality was painted in blood, and that crossing it carried consequences that no amount of fame or money could undo. "What happens now?" I asked, not entirely sure who I was addressing. Frank looked up from his phone. "Now we regroup, file the reports, fix what can be fixed. And if it can't be fixed?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Some things once broken stayed broken. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Some knowledge, once gained, changed you forever. As the Prague emergency crews continued their work around us, I realized that we'd accomplished something unprecedented in Hollywood. We'd created authenticity so complete that it had ceased Tobe acting entirely. The cameras had captured something real, not just a car chase, but the exact moment when Matt Damon discovered that Jason Bourne's world was more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The question now was whether that authenticity was worth what it had cost us all. The hotel room felt like a prison cell with better thread count. I'd been staring at the Prague skyline for 3 hours, watching afternoon shadows creep across buildings that had witnessed centuries of human folly, and wondering if I'd just added my name to their long list of cautionary tales. My hands had finally stopped shaking, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those school children's faces, bright jackets scattered like confetti, their teacher's expression shifting from annoyance to absolute terror in the span of a heartbeat. The phone had been ringing constantly. My agent, my publicist, Ben, calling from Los Angeles after hearing rumors. My mother, somehow having gotten wind that something had gone wrong, her voice tight with the kind of worry that cuts through Hollywood's careful spin like a knife through silk. I'd let them all go to voicemail, unable to face the questions I couldn't answer, the explanations that would sound insane to anyone who hadn't been behind that wheel. How do you tell your mother that you nearly killed children for the sake of authentic entertainment? The knock on my door came at exactly 4:30, punctual as Swiss clockwork and twice as ominous. I knew who it would be before I opened it. Frank Marshall and Doug Liman, with the kind of expressions that movie executives wear when millions of dollars are hanging in the balance, and their stars having what the insurance policies euphemistically call confidence issues. "Matt," Frank said, stepping into the room without invitation, "we need to talk." Doug followed, looking like he hadn't slept since the accident. His usual manic energy was still there, but it had curdled into something desperate. Behind them came someone I didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive suit who radiated the particular authority that comes with having the power to greenlight or kill $100 million projects. "This is Sarah Chun," Frank said, from Universal. "She flew in from Los Angeles this morning." Sarah Chun. I'd heard the name whispered in Hollywood circles. The studio executive who'd killed more careers than bad reviews and cocaine combined. Her presence here meant the situation had escalated beyond Prague, beyond our small production, into the rarefied air where decisions got made that affected stock prices and board meetings. "Mr. Damon," she said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that precedes devastating news, "I'm sure you understand why I'm here." I gestured to the chairs by the window, suddenly aware that I was still wearing the clothes from the morning, jeans and a t-shirt that smelled of adrenaline and fear and the metallic tang of near disaster. Sarah sat with the kind of precision that suggested she'd calculated exactly how much this conversation was going to cost in various scenarios. "The Prague incident has created some complications," she began, opening a leather portfolio that probably contained my professional future in neat columns of figures. "We've managed to contain the media attention for now, but that won't last. The Czech authorities are asking questions. The insurance company is conducting its own investigation. And frankly, there are people in Los Angeles who are questioning whether this production should continue. The words hung in the hotel room air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Of course," Sarah continued, "we have significant investment in this project. Your participation is essential, but we need to know that you're committed to finishing what we started." "Committed," I repeated, tasting the word. "You mean willing to risk my life again for your profit margins?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. "Matt, that's not fair. This was an accident, a confluence of factors that nearly killed children." The words exploded out of me with a force that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. There were school children, Frank. Kids walking to school who suddenly found themselves diving out of the way because I was playing soldier for the cameras. Sarah's expression didn't change, but I caught something flickering behind her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or the recognition that they were dealing with someone who was no longer thinking like a rational business partner. "The children weren't harmed," she said evenly. "No one was seriously injured. The cars can be replaced. What concerns us is your state of mind." My state of mind. As if psychological trauma was just another line item to be managed, like catering budgets or location fees. "My state of mind," I said slowly, "is that I'm questioning every decision that brought me to this room, that I'm wondering if Jason Bourne is worth becoming someone I don't recognize. I'm asking myself what the hell I was thinking when I convinced myself that authenticity was worth nearly committing vehicular manslaughter." Doug leaned forward, his director's instincts kicking in. "Matt, what happened today? That's exactly what Bourne would have felt. The fear, the uncertainty, the weight of consequences. You didn't just act those emotions, you lived them. That's something you can't get from CGI or stunt doubles. And if I'd kill someone, would that have made the performance even more authentic?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside the window, Prague continued its ancient rhythm. People walking home from work, couples meeting for dinner, normal human beings living normal lives without wondering if their professional choices might result in accidentally destroying innocence. Sarah cleared her throat. Mr. Damon, I understand you're shaken by today's events, but we need to discuss practical matters. We have a filming schedule, contractual obligations, financial commitments that extend far beyond your personal feelings about what happened. My personal feelings, I echoed. Is that what we're calling it? We're calling it a temporary setback that can be overcome with proper support and adjusted safety protocols, she replied, her tone suggesting this conversation was following a script she'd used before with other traumatized actors. What we cannot call it is grounds for abandoning a project that represents careers, jobs, and investments for hundreds of people. There was the Hollywood guilt trip that had kept more actors working through injury and trauma than any union contract ever could. Not just my career on the line, but everyone's. The grip who'd moved to Prague for this job. The caterer who'd invested in new equipment. The Czech crew member should see their government's film incentives disappear if Hollywood decided Prague was too dangerous. How many times? I asked, surprising myself with the question. I'm sorry. How many times has Universal had this conversation? How many actors have sat in hotel rooms like this, being told that their trauma is a temporary setback that needs to be overcome for the greater good? Sarah's composure cracked slightly. Mr. Damon, I don't think that's a productive line of, because I'm wondering if Tom Cruise ever sat in a room like this after mission. Impossible. If Keanu had this conversation after The Matrix. If there's a whole infrastructure for managing actors who discover that action movies are actually dangerous. Frank jumped in, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Matt, we're not asking you to do anything unsafe. We can adjust the remaining sequences. Use doubles for the more dangerous work. Use doubles. I laughed, but it came out bitter and hollow. After spending months insisting that authenticity required me to do everything myself. After building the entire marketing campaign around real action, real actor, real stunts. Now you want to use doubles. We want to finish the film, Doug said quietly. However, we need to do that. And there it was, the admission that everything we'd said about authenticity and commitment had been marketing speak. When push came to shove, when real consequences threatened their investment, the studio was perfectly willing to abandon the principles they'd asked me to risk my life for. I walked to the window, looking down at the Prague street where morning had brought near disaster and afternoon had brought cold calculation. Somewhere in this city, a teacher was probably still trying to explain to 20 children why their walk to school had turned into a scene from an action movie. Somewhere, a Mercedes driver was nursing a concussion because he'd trusted that Hollywood professionals knew what they were doing. I need to know something, I said without turning around. If I'd hit those kids today, what would this conversation sound like? The silence stretched so long I thought they'd left. When Sarah finally answered, her voice was carefully neutral. That's not a scenario we need to consider. But if we did consider it, if there were 20 injured children and international headlines and criminal charges, would you still be here asking me to honor my contractual obligations? Matt, Frank started. Would you? I turned to face them and saw in their expressions everything I needed to know. Sarah's calculated calm. Frank's producer anxiety. Doug's artistic desperation. None of them were thinking about the children who'd scattered like startled birds. They were thinking about schedules and budgets and whether Universal's stock price could survive a public relations disaster. This is about more than just finishing a movie, I said. This is about who I want to be. Not just as an actor, but as a human being. And right now, I don't like what I'm seeing in the mirror. Sarah stood up, her patience apparently exhausted. Mr. Damon, let me be direct. Your contract specifies significant financial penalties for early termination without cause. Walking away from this production would cost you personally, professionally, and legally. It would also damage relationships that you've spent years building in this industry. There it was. The threat wrapped in legal language and delivered with boardroom precision. Not just me career, but my entire future in Hollywood balanced on my willingness to pretend that nearly killing children was just another occupational hazard. And if I stay, I asked, what then? We all pretend this never happened? We go back to treating real danger like it's just another performance challenge. We implement better safety protocols, Frank said. We adjust the remaining sequences. We make sure nothing like this happens again. You can't guarantee that. We can minimize the risk. You can't guarantee it. The words came out louder than I intended, carrying the weight of fear it'd been holding back all day. Because the risk isn't just in the stunts, it's in the mindset. It's in the moment when you stop being Matt Damon acting like Jason Bourne and start being Jason Bourne pretending to be Matt Damon. And once you cross that line, once you convince yourself that fiction is more real than reality, anything can happen. Doug was staring at me with something that might have been recognition. You're talking about method acting taken to its logical extreme. I'm talking about losing my mind for the sake of entertainment, I corrected, and nearly taking innocent people with me. The room fell silent again. Through the window, I could see Prague's ancient spires reaching toward ASCII that was beginning to darken with approaching evening. Somewhere in this city, people were going about their lives without wondering if their commitment to authenticity might result in accidentally destroying everything they claimed to value. I need time, I said finally, to think, to figure out if I can do this without becoming someone I can't live with. Sarah's voice was ice-cold professional. How much time? I don't know. The production can't wait indefinitely. Then maybe it shouldn't wait at all. The words hung in the air like a confession. Not just that I might walk away, but that maybe I should. Maybe the smart thing, the right thing, the human thing was to admit that some prices were too high to pay for the privilege of entertaining strangers. Sarah closed her portfolio with the kind of finality that suggested decisions had already been made in rooms I'd never see. Mr. Damon, I'll be direct one final time. Universal has invested too much in this project to accept artistic temperament as grounds for abandonment. If you cannot complete your contractual obligations due to personal issues, we will pursue every available remedy to protect our investment, including destroying my career, including whatever becomes necessary. The threat was naked now, stripped of legal euphemisms and boardroom courtesy. Finish the movie or face professional extinction. Honor your commitment to fictional violence or watch your real career die. After they left, I sat alone in the gathering Prague darkness, staring at a city that had survived wars and revolutions and centuries of human ambition gone wrong. My phone buzzed constantly. Agents, publicists, journalists who'd somehow gotten wind that something significant had happened on the Bourne set. I ignored them all, focused instead on a single question that seemed to encompass everything. Was I strong enough to walk away from everything I'd worked for, or too weak to risk losing it? The answer, I realized with growing dread, would determine not just my future as an actor, but my future as a human being worthy of the title. And as Prague's ancient streets whispered their secrets to the night wind, I found myself genuinely uncertain which choice would require more courage, staying or leaving. The phone rang again. This time I answered. Matt, Ben's voice, calling from Los Angeles, tight with concern. Jesus, man, I've been trying to reach you for hours. Are you okay? I don't know, I said, and realized it was the most honest thing I'd said all day. What happened over there? The rumors are crazy. I looked out at Prague's skyline, at a city that had witnessed centuries of human folly, and wondered what story I would tell about this day. The Hollywood version, sanitized for public consumption? Or truth, that I nearly killed children in pursuit of authentic entertainment and was now being asked to pretend it was just another day at the office? I almost became someone I couldn't live with, I said finally. And now I have to decide if I'm brave enough to stop. I stayed, not because of Sarah Chin's threats, or Frank's financial calculations, or even Doug's artistic vision. I stayed because walking away would have been just another form of running, and I'd spent my entire life running from the possibility that I might not be enough. But I stayed differently. The next morning, I met with the entire crew in Prague's old grain warehouse that served as our production base. Word had spread about the accident. In film crews, news travels faster than light and with roughly the same ability to illuminate dark corners. Everyone knew something significant had happened, even if the official story was sanitized corporate speak about technical difficulties and equipment malfunctions. "I want to talk about yesterday," I said, standing in front of 50 faces that ranged from curious to concerned to carefully neutral. Not the version that'll end up in the press kit, but what actually happened. Gary Powell shifted uncomfortably. Frank looked like he was calculating the legal liability of honesty. Doug watched me with the intensity he usually reserved for monitoring camera angles. I lost control. I continued. Not just of the car, but of my judgment. I put civilians at risk because he was more concerned with looking authentic than being responsible. And I want everyone here to know that won't happen again. The silence that followed was different from the tomb-like quiet after the accident. This was the silence of professionals recalibrating, of people deciding whether they could trust someone who'd just admitted to a fundamental failure of leadership. From now on, I said, every stunt decision goes through Gary first, then the insurance coordinators, then me. If anyone thinks something is unsafe, we stop. No questions, no pressure, no concerns about schedule or budget. Because no movie is worth what almost happened yesterday. That was the day I learned the difference between fearlessness and courage. Fearlessness is the absence of fear, a condition that's either pathological or imaginary. Courage is feeling the fear and choosing your actions despite it, not because of it. We finished the Bourne Identity over the next 6 weeks, but it was a different film than the one we'd started. More careful, perhaps. Less reckless, certainly. But not less authentic. If anything, more so. Because true authenticity isn't about risking everything for the sake of appearance. It's about being honest about what you're willing to sacrifice and what you're not. The Prague incident never made it into the behind-the-scenes documentaries. The insurance investigation concluded with bureaucratic language about equipment failure and unforeseen circumstances. The Czech authorities filed their reports and moved on to more pressing matters. Officially, nothing significant had happened during the filming of a Hollywood action movie in their ancient city. But unofficially, everything had changed. I noticed it first in how other actors looked at me at industry events. Not the usual mixture of professional courtesy and competitive assessment, but something deeper, a recognition that I'd crossed a line most of them would never approach. Some seemed impressed. Others seemed concerned for my mental health. A few seemed almost envious, as if surviving a brush with disaster had granted me membership in an exclusive club they desperately wanted to join. The film's success surprised everyone, including Universal. Audiences responded to something in my performance that even I hadn't fully understood while we were shooting it. Critics used words like visceral and lived in and authentic, the same word that had nearly gotten me killed, but now applied to something that felt genuinely earned rather than desperately performed. Jason Bourne became a franchise, and I became an action star, but not the kind I'd originally imagined. I never again insisted on doing every stunt myself. I worked with some of the best stunt performers in the business and learned to trust their expertise rather than questioning their commitment. I discovered that authenticity in performance doesn't require literal authenticity in every physical action. But more importantly, I learned something about fear that no acting coach had ever taught me. Fear isn't the enemy of authentic performance. It's the foundation of it. Every character worth playing is afraid of something. Every story worth telling involves someone confronting what terrifies them most. The key isn't eliminating fear, but understanding what your character fears and why, then finding that fear within yourself without needing to literally recreate the circumstances that would produce it. Jason Bourne was afraid of forgetting who he was, of losing himself in the violence that defined his existence. After Prague, I understood that fear in ways I never could have accessed through research or imagination. Not because I nearly died in a car accident, but because I nearly lost myself in the pursuit of becoming someone else. Years later, when young actors ask me about doing their own stunts, I tell them about Prague. Not the sanitized Hollywood version, but the truth that the most dangerous stunt any actor can perform is confusing their identity with their characters. That the real courage isn't in facing physical danger, but in admitting when you've gone too far, when your commitment to authenticity has crossed the line into recklessness that endangers not just yourself, but innocent people who never asked to be part of your performance. I think about those school children sometimes, especially when I'm watching action movies with meowing kids. I wonder if any of them remember the morning when their walk to school turned into a scene from a Hollywood thriller. I hope they don't, but if they do, I hope they remember that the adults around them, their teacher, the emergency responders, even the reckless actor who nearly ran him down, ultimately made the right choices when it mattered most. The Prague incident taught me that there are two kinds of stories in Hollywood, the ones we tell audiences and the ones we tell ourselves. The first kind needs to be entertaining. The second kind needs to be true. And sometimes, if you're very lucky or very careful, they can be the same thing. The Bourne Identity launched a successful franchise and established me as an action star capable of carrying $100 million movies. But its real success, for me at least, was more personal. It was a day I learned that Matt Damon was interesting enough to play Jason Bourne without becoming him, strong enough to handle action sequences without needing to prove his fearlessness, and human enough to admit when he'd made potentially catastrophic mistakes. The car chase through Prague appears in the final film for exactly 37 seconds. 37 seconds of carefully edited footage that audiences around the world have watched and rewound and analyzed frame by frame. They see Jason Bourne stealing a BMW and escaping through narrow European streets, pursued by assassins who want him dead. They don't see the Mercedes that nearly killed us both. They don't see the school children diving for safety. They don't see the moment when fiction and reality collided so violently that I forgot which one I was supposed to be living in. But I see all of it every time I watch that sequence. And what I see isn't just a car chase or an action sequence or 37 seconds of entertainment. I see the exact moment when I learned the most important lesson of my career. The most authentic performance isn't about becoming someone else completely. It's about finding the parts of someone else that already exist within you and being brave enough to let them show without losing yourself in the process. That's what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the wisdom to know when fear is trying to protect you from your own worst instincts. 23 years later, I still drive carefully through narrow streets. I still think twice before insisting I can handle something that professionals are trained for. And I still remember the sound of children crying, the sight of scattered orange pylons, and the feeling of realizing that some mistakes you only get to make once. Jason Bourne spent 3 movies trying to remember who he was before the violence consumed him. After Prague, I never forgot who I was underneath the characters I played. And in the end, that made me not just a better actor, but a better man. One who finally understood that the most dangerous stunt of all is forgetting the difference between who you are and who you are pretending to be. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. That way, you'll always be with us discovering the secrets and untold sides of the most famous lives in history.